Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming today. So this is the last of our public engagements on density by design for this week. My name is Andrea Gummo, I'm the project manager for this project. So just a little bit of background on the project. We're right at the start right now. So this week we've been going out and having several events just like this one and some smaller meetings, basically to get your input before we get into coming up with our actual draft policies. So we're here today to provide a background information about the context of mid-rise and tall buildings within the city, and also to provide sort of like a quick education on the various design elements that go into the building of those buildings. So what this project is doing is it's looking at how buildings will be built, not where. So we'll be doing kind of additional work to determine the exact locations for mid-rise and tall buildings in 2020. And I'd like to also introduce Paige Agnew, who's our Director of Planning, Building, and Licensing, and Brent Toderian, who's a planning consultant who's advising us on this project and a number of other matters as well. So today we're going to take you through a little bit of a presentation, and we're going to ask that you hold any questions just until the end of the presentation. Then we'll have a little bit of time to answer any questions you might have, and then we'd like to get into groups and discuss 2 questions that we have for you that we need your help with as we go forward and start to draft these policies. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Paige.
Thank you everyone for coming. I recognize a lot of familiar faces in the room, but some new ones as well. And it's always great to have as many people as possible at the table because these are very important conversations we're having as a city, and we need to hear from everybody. In terms of the context, this gives you a general idea of some of the context pieces that we've considered and that we'll continue to consider throughout the project. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the interrelationship between these pieces and how they're going to inform the policy work going forward. In terms of the sustainability element, so Kingston already has pretty lofty aspirations with respect to sustainability. We've made the statement of wanting to be Canada's most sustainable city, and that certainly is a very strong leadership position, but it has to come with a lot of action as a result. So we're on a path towards sustainability. We're not there yet, and this work is going to be critical, in my opinion, in helping us to achieve that goal. Climate change emergency. So let's take the goal of being Canada's most sustainable city, and then we add on top of it Council's recent declaration about a climate emergency in Kingston joining in that national, international conversation about what's happening with respect to climate change globally, and looking specifically locally within our own community about the commitments we want to make to lowering our carbon footprint. Our current housing situation. As a community, our vacancy rate is 0.6%. Last year, it was 0.7%. And for 2 years in a row, we're the lowest vacancy rate of any community in Ontario. So we do have what I'm calling a temporary short-term housing issue. I say temporary in nature because we know we have about 3,600 units that are already approved and ready for construction but haven't yet been built. So when we look at the fact that we have that number, it's not that we're not approving housing, we're actually having difficulty getting that housing to go from approval to construction. So with building permits being issued daily and new housing coming into the market, I'm anticipating within a couple of years we're going to see a correction. But we've also been a low vacancy rate as a community historically for the last 10 years. We've had some fluctuations. We've had a point where I believe we got close to 3% or maybe just about 3%, but typically on average we've trended below that. So while you have a low vacancy rate, it definitely is interrelated with the ability of housing supply in the community directly, but also it has strong links to the affordability of the housing that's available. In terms of the official plan and the policy context, so I've talked about this a little bit publicly, but from a staff perspective, what we've identified and working through the official plan, and we are a team that's changed a lot over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of new planners, new management, a new approach to thinking about planning. Our current document in our official plan, it's very big, it's 600 pages, it does have a lot of detail, but even though it has a lot of detail, there are also areas that are very vague or maybe too permissive. And with respect to looking at density in particular, what our plan says is that the majority of our growth is to be within this orange area. So this is the Princess Street corridor. So it's identified as our main corridor, and that we have three major nodes. So this is downtown, this is the Kingston Center, and then this is the Cataraqui Center. What it also says is that high density buildings or medium density buildings can also be considered anywhere within these yellow areas. These are all housing districts, subject to meeting locational criteria. So again, when we look at strategically locating growth within the city, we have to make sure that our policies are specific enough and they give the right direction and expectation, not just with respect to where we want to see this form of housing, but how we want to build that housing. And that's what this policy exercise is about. Heritage context, and this is incredibly important for Kingston. As a community that has over 1,200 properties listed in terms of heritage interests and over 600 Part 4 designated or Part 5 designated, we're very rich in cultural heritage. So we couldn't do this policy work with having a strong understanding and respect for the context of the cultural heritage elements that are within Kingston and looking at the appropriate balance between conservation and preservation. And how do we really strike that balance of achieving appropriate new infill development within a heritage context that's very rich and important to the city on a continued basis? Linking transportation, land use, planning, and climate change. Again, going back to some of the comments I made at the beginning about Kingston's aspirations with respect to sustainability and climate change, what we've began to realize more and more as a city, and this is something that Brent is working on is very strongly now, is that we need to do a much better job of directly linking our transportation strategies with our land use strategies. And particularly as a community, when we've said in 2014 as a city and our council confirmed that, and again through the 2017 official plan, we want the urban area of Kingston, the serviced area of Kingston to stay the same size. We're making that commitment because instead of outward expansion, we want to focus on the growth going forward for the next number of years to really be within that built-up urban area. So the only way to really achieve the GHG reduction that we're talking about or the climate change goals that we set forward for ourselves is to look at being very strategic with how we align new transportation investments, active transportation, and where we're locating density and proximity to them to make sure that we get people having the options or more options of getting out of their cars and moving differently around the city. Again, strengthening areas, this is something that's very important, and we've seen some of the impact of that in the Williamsville corridor in particular in the last 5 years. These types of policies have the ability to really strengthen areas, bring new communities to life, bring amenities, cultural diversity, cultural interest to areas of the city that maybe are underutilized. They could be brownfields and contaminated. They just could be pretty vacant or mostly undeveloped altogether. And as a result of that, maybe the vitality isn't there. So through good design and good building design, there's an excellent opportunity to strengthen areas within the city that have maybe dwindled or haven't had the vitality we've been looking for. And that's certainly something that we're looking to achieve by way of a public interest goal throughout this work. Unpredictable energy costs as well. So this is linked to greenhouse gas emissions, but also to the livability of the city. There's a lot of fluctuations in energy costs. How does that affect people from a vulnerability perspective? And when we provide additional options to get people out of their cars or less vulnerable to those fluctuations, it makes the city a lot more livable altogether. And it just helps as a community to be focusing on some of those GHG goals that we've situated for ourselves and that we've identified going forward. One of the last big pieces is changing demographics. We've talked about this as a community to some extent, and there's actually a report coming to council next week talking about what our next version of the population housing and demographic numbers are for Kingston, looking at the next 30 years. So what we know as a community, there's two important factors. A, we're an aging demographic, which means we have a large part of our population and an older part of the age cohort specifically. We know that people aren't having as many children as they used to, and that's not just something that's specific to Kingston, it's specific to Eastern Ontario and nationally as well. So as a community, we have to work hard to overcome some of our natural demographics. So what we're saying is that as a community, if we want to be sustainable in the long run, if we just wait and see what happens with natural demographics, we're going to see a declining population over time. And as a community, that isn't good from a sustainability, a vitality perspective. So we have to work hard to try to increase net migration. Net migration is bringing new people into the community, and certainly from our perspective, we want to retain the people that we have. So we've got lots of seniors. We have to be thinking about that from a housing perspective, what works for seniors, what type of housing, how can we help people age in place. And from a millennial perspective, we know that millennials are now the largest faction of people in the workforce, and they're going to be critical to Kingston's workforce going forward. So what are the types of things from an urban vitality, urban living perspective that we need to be thinking about and how we plan our city to ensure that we can attract and retain new people as well? Because not everyone is interested in living in a low-density suburban environment. There's lots of people that are in the millennial generation. They're actually looking for a more urban, densified type of living, and Kingston only has the ability to provide that to a certain extent at present.
Hello everyone, I'm Brent Toderian. I've been helping the city since a year and 3 months ago. So one of you said you were surprised that it's been that long. I think it was you. I'm a little surprised too. The year is sort of blurred by. But I've been doing a lot of work with Paige and her staff on many things. This is the beginning of this process, but we've been educating ourselves on this challenge for well over a year because, as you know, there's a lot of applications, a lot of development pressures happening in the city, and we've been sort of learning as we go, as I've been helping staff negotiate many of the actual tall and mid-rise buildings that are being proposed around the city. When I was visiting you and your council originally last year, this is one of the things I talked about, the idea of density done well. It always has a value of talking about this because when a city hall is talking about density, sometimes the perception can be, well, why are we talking about that? That's about developer profit, isn't it? Well, there's lots of public interest reasons why we specifically talk about density, but why we emphasize that there is a way to do it well and a way to do it badly. And I think you'll recall I had some observations on some of the poorly done density in the history of Kingston before. But if you do it well, not only do you reduce energy use, which is over 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, our energy use as a society in Canada, but it also facilitates walking, biking, and transit, which is the transportation part of energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So density, when you do it well, relates to by far the two largest generators of greenhouse gas emissions, buildings and transportation, and has all the other benefits that I'm going to talk about in a minute over and above greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to actual green design, having your buildings be designed better, there's a lot of things over and above just things like passive design and such that are only possible with high density. The idea that certain approaches to building design, like district cogeneration and heat sharing and energy sharing within buildings, and district energy, which is a big game-changing idea where you can take the building energy of a building right off the grid and use renewable resources to power buildings and even neighborhoods. These are the kinds of things that really will get us to the point of addressing our climate emergency, but they're really only possible with minimum densities, and certain designs, building designs, clusters of densities, concentrations of densities around energy sources like hospitals, etc. So more green design options, less general pressure. Now, Paige has talked a lot this week about the fact that council has already made the decision not to expand the urban boundary, but even so, there's always pressure to do that. And when you're building up and making that decision to build up, less pressure on agricultural land, less eroding and eating up of your wetlands, which you've certainly lost a lot of here in Ontario, and other vulnerable environmental features and such that tend to get gobbled up as you move out. So the benefits of moving up means less pressure from sprawl. More affordable housing choices certainly, improve public health, diversity, vitality, safety, a lot of the things we aspire to do in cities. Density is at least a big part of the puzzle, but again, only if you do them well. That's why this conversation is about how to do it well, not whether to do it or not, but how to do it well. I'm going to stand over here. When I talk about climate change and discuss it in the context of city building, I often use images from all over the world, or certainly other parts of Canada. These images we've literally taken from the last few days. Every night this week, as we've been talking to your neighbors, I, for one, have been going back to my hotel room and turning on the TV, and this is what I'm seeing. And it's pretty hard for me. I was raised not that far from here in Perth, Ontario, and the Ottawa is still, I sort of consider it my home city, if you will. And to see this happen, to know it happened just 2 years ago, the idea that these floods that used to be known as 100-year floods or even 500-year floods are becoming more and more common. This is climate change, and even your Premier, Doug Ford, who hasn't necessarily always made the connections, shall we say, between these events and climate change, even he's saying it these days. My French-Canadian family around Montreal is experiencing this, even in some of their direct neighborhoods. So whether it's flooding, whether it's wildfires out west, whether it's any number of implications, and yes, it might potentially come and hit you this time. And even if it misses you this time, it's certainly been here before, the idea of flooding or ice storms or what have you. When you understand that climate change is about unpredictability of weather, the frequency and intensity of storm events, there is a direct connection between all of these and climate change. And if storm events aren't going to be the serious issue, I often say it's the little things that we can't predict about climate change that might end up being our greatest threats. In many parts of the world where I work, it's mosquitoes. I work in Latin America and other places. The spread of Zika, directly attributed to temperature change, is an awfully big conversation. When I was here last year, I keynoted the Sustainable Kingston event. The other keynote was Dr. Roberta Bondar, and she talked almost exclusively about ticks, which was news to me, about how ticks directly related to temperature change have spread Lyme disease in your context more than it ever has, to historic levels. These are things we don't think of when we think about how to prepare ourselves for the consequences of climate change. If you're not motivated by that, the public health implications, even beyond climate change, the public health implications of how we design cities and suburbs, how we get around in them, substantial. The public health care officials are some of the most powerful voices in the conversation about needing to be more transit-supported, transit-friendly, walking and biking, and just density, the power of nearness, as I call it. And it allows us to live, potentially, if we choose, healthier lifestyles. And when the doctors are saying that the most important thing we could do for preventative medicine to prevent the epidemic of preventable diseases that are related to lifestyle is to build our communities differently, that gets the media's attention, it gets the politicians' attention, etc. And if that doesn't get the politicians' attention, money usually does, because not only is there a massive amount of public money attributed to our public healthcare system, hence the last slide, but infrastructure costs. A number of cities around Canada are taking the lead. Some of the best studies anywhere in the world that are inspiring cities outside of Canada are doing the math on growing up versus out. And Halifax, for example, Kingston is catching up on this very quickly and doing a lot of math lately around costs of infrastructure. But Halifax, for example, did a study that found that just by turning the dial of how much growth goes up versus out, the difference, the conservative estimate, was $3 billion over the life of a plan. Boy, that got the politicians' attention, no matter what your political stripe was. So whatever it is that motivates you, and hopefully all these things motivate you, the point is a lot of the challenges we are facing directly is related to how we build our cities and suburbs, and density in particular. But we're talking about height today, not that the two things aren't strongly related. I always do say that you can do density without height, and you can also have height without density. But this is the first time I've decided to create this slide. So why height then? Well, the best reason to do height is to get more density. And we do have to be careful, because you can actually have proposals that are taller but less dense, which is actually, I think, the worst of both worlds, the worst case scenario. But if you do it right and well, and you're using height to achieve more density, you can do it with more density and less impact, better urban design performance, streetscape quality, public views, private views, shadowing, etc. That's a bit counterintuitive, because some people think that the taller the building is, the more the impact it'll have. Well, it depends on how you design the tall building. It also depends on how the alternative type of building, a more mid-rise or perimeter block building, is designed. But if you do height well, it has less impact. That's actually mathematically showable. And at the same time, it provides more market choice. Not everyone wants to live in a mid-rise. Not everyone wants to live in a high-rise. It's nice to have choice. I actually call it ground people and sky people, because I meet people all the time who tell me what their preference is. And what I learned from that is we're not all the same. We all have different ideas and preferences. Private views are actually one of the reasons why people like height. And I used to dismiss that a bit. But when you live in a beautiful city like Kingston, and the tallness lets you experience the view, if that's the reason why people are choosing to live in urban settings and live a smaller carbon footprint life and walk more and drive their car less, which is better for everyone, if it's the private view that gets them to do it, then great. I'm a fan of private views because there's a public interest to that. So enhanced market interest in urban living. And yes, under your existing system, and that system is getting more robust, it's evolving, you can leverage density or height to have developers essentially pay for the community benefits and the amenities that you need to meet many of your goals. Amenities to make your density livable and lovable. Other benefits like affordable housing to provide more diversity and affordability in your communities, etc. I always say height and density, community benefits are not the reason to do height and density. That would be what I call tail wagging the dog. But if you're going to do height and density, community benefits and integrating them into the design is a way to do density successfully. You have some talented cartoonists. Someone said the cartoonist might be in the audience. Is there a cartoonist in the audience? No. Oh, yes. Did you do this one?
Yes.
I quite like these. Did you do this one?
Yes.
I like them.
Thank you.
I wish I could draw that well. I like them because it shows what we're trying to avoid. If the proposal is for a big, ugly, overly large building, I'm the first one to say it's a bad idea. I might not be the first one, but I'm one of the first ones to say it's a bad idea. And if the real choice is between this and this, I might choose this too, because I don't like this. But that's not what we need to have. Although maybe it's analogous to what you've been getting. But you don't need to get that, and you certainly shouldn't allow this kind of thing. But it's a nice cartoon, but it's a bit of a false choice, because those aren't the two things we're choosing between. What we should be choosing between, well, in truth, what we are choosing between, no questions, yes, sir.
The alternatives presented at the time.
Okay, fair enough. What you are choosing, the truth of the matter is, because the policy does allow contemplation of tall buildings, and you're seeing them actually happen, maybe you are choosing between this and something that's a lot better. And I would certainly say to you, you should be choosing a lot better. And that's what the last year or so has been about. An example I showed you a year ago was the Montparnasse Tower. I actually call this whole conversation the Montparnasse effect. Do people know the Montparnasse Tower in Paris? It's the neighborhood. It literally casts shadow on the beautiful historic Montparnasse Cemetery. I call it the middle finger to Parisians that made them hate tall buildings, because for about 40 or 50 years after this was built, there were no other tall buildings built in Paris until La Défense was starting to construct it, and they went big on tall towers in that part of Paris. But the line was, if that's what we're going to get with tall buildings, we don't want tall buildings. And I completely get that response. But again, that's not our only two choices. So what I'm going to do now, because it relates specifically to the question we're asking you today, because when we roll up our sleeves and put you to an exercise, is since I said to you a year ago that my observation was your entire conversation about tall buildings tends to be about how many floors the building has. That's sort of how the conversation starts and stops. And I don't think that, I said at the time, I thought that was a problem, because there's a lot more to tall buildings than just how many floors they have. I'm going to take you through the various elements of tall buildings, not just for an academic exercise, but because these are the elements that our policy is actually going to consider. So you don't have to take notes or take pictures. There's a small drawing on the back of the comment sheet that shows this. And we're going to be asking you questions about, if you don't have comment sheets, our colleague can pass them around, so you don't need to be distracted. And as I go through, the key is to make sure you understand the terminology we use, but really the concept, the importance of the concept and how they fit together. So although I say that height isn't the only thing, it is an important thing. And so we'll start with that. And it's probably also the thing that most people intuitively understand. How tall the building is relatively straightforward. How many floors it has, how many feet tall it is. But at least equally important, as I said to you over a year ago, is how thick the building is, how wide the building is, and how its thickness or wideness expresses itself from different vantage points. It may be a box, it may be wider from one view and thinner from another view. But this can have at least as much of an effect on the, if you will, bigness of the building. And one of the lines I said to you a year ago was, I'm not sure you have a tall building problem, but you certainly have a big building problem, because you have massive buildings where they're not necessarily too tall, but they are certainly too big. Some examples of that. We talked a lot last year about slabs. The idea that you can have a building that maybe isn't necessarily too tall, but it sure is wide. And these photos also show how orientation is important. In this particular case, the slab buildings are side-oriented to a busy road, and they can be stepped back. There's other examples that I've seen around your city where they're stepped back dramatically from the street with an intervening green lawn or a surface parking lot so that they don't have much of a relationship with the street edge. Or they can be in a downtown setting, for example, where it's just as wide a building, but it's oriented right up to the street, and it actually has at-grade uses along that at least activate the street. And it shows how you can take two elements, three elements, or even four that I'm going through. Width being one thing, which is a problem in this building, in my opinion. But its orientation is good because it's oriented to the street edge to activate and strengthen the sidewalk, although it probably should be set back more because that sidewalk width is not particularly generous. And it has at-grade uses to activate the street, so it's doing some things well and other things not well. And how you understand those kinds of interrelationships between the elements. I used this image when I arrived because I joke my hosts, your city hall made the mistake of giving me a hotel room where that was my view when I opened up my window the first morning. And so I took a picture of it. The idea that you could take these kind of slab buildings, put them in your most sensitive context, the waterfront, and essentially take all the public view for everyone else with this kind of expression at the water edge, problematic from my perspective. Shall we say I wasn't very complimentary. And I'll show you an alternative to this in just a minute. So that's I've already started to talk about it, but that's orientation as well. Width and orientation work a lot together. It's essentially the setback from the lot line, the relationship to the street edge. Makes a big difference on whether a building that's wide does some things well. A wide building step back is your worst case scenario. When you start to assemble tall buildings, and you haven't seen that yet, but it will be an issue here, then you have to start thinking about how close they can be together above, say, 8 or 9 or 12 stories. Because you can end up with not very wide buildings, but if they're so close together, it can essentially be a de facto wall, a de facto block. So tower separation rules are quite common in cities, and we'll show you some examples of that later. This is an example that I use. I'm always a bit wary to use examples from Vancouver because I don't want you folks to say to me, well, we're not Vancouver. Of course you're not. But what Vancouver was the first city to do in Canada was to establish dramatic tower separation rules, which many other cities have now copied. So 25-meter tower separation distance between the towers. These towers are substantially taller than the ones I just showed you on your own waterfront, but they don't create a wall. And they actually have layers of views all the way back where you can see all the way through the downtown to the mountains on the other side. And the private views are layered in light access through the downtown, sun and light access, privacy between towers, no wind tunnel effect because you don't get a wind tunnel effect when you do these kinds of buildings. So lots of benefits to thinner towers and tower separation as opposed to the slab buildings.
Sorry, Mr. Toderian.
Yes?
Can I trouble you with a question?
No, I'm sorry, we were holding questions to the end.
No problem.
Sure. It's not that long though, we're almost done.
Yeah, that's correct.
So the next two work well together and are related to each other. The step back, we call this the setback from the street. The step back of the building makes a step and essentially contributes to creating what's called a podium. So the idea that you have, and there's your podium, the idea that you have on top of or underneath a slim tower, you essentially have a mid-rise. And you can get the benefits of the mid-rise, a human scale, a sense of enclosure on the street, a massing that doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're in a tall building context. But if you do the step back right and the tower separation right, then you don't have a wall of building above you. And you actually can get the benefits of the high rise added to the benefits of the mid rise. Because the benefits of the high rise is additional density. And the benefits of the mid rise is the human scaled approach to how the building lands. That's the step back and the podium can work together. Now, not every tall building has to have a podium. But in certain contexts, like where you have prevailing scale buildings, like in your downtown or in other places, podiums can work really well. And we were asked several times this week, how high should the podium be? And I usually say a good starting point for that question is, what's your prevailing scale of the existing buildings in the neighborhood or on the street? So just a few examples of different ways that podiums can be done. Very high podiums, very low podiums, 2 to 3 story townhouse podiums. And then the ground plane. You can do a lot of things right up here, but if the building lands poorly and creates blank walls at grade, at the street edge, at eye level, at 5 kilometers an hour, the pedestrian speed, which is how most of us actually interact with buildings on a daily basis, then you can have streets that don't feel comfortable, that are boring, that don't reward the pedestrian for making a good choice and walking instead of taking some other way of getting around, and can even feel unsafe. So how the ground floor is done. And often the conversation is about retailing. We all picture stores, interesting stores that activate the street edge, or restaurants with the patio seating that come out and make for a great space. Not every retail street or every street is going to have or should have retail, but the ones that don't can have housing. A lot of the projects we've been working on over the last year with your staff are about having actual doors, residential doors, for people who live there right on the street as a way to humanize the street edge. So, and there's an art to that in terms of how to actually design that interface so it's successful. And I think the city's come a long way in understanding that art in even the last year. So lots of different ways you can activate the street, but you really have to get that element right if you want your streets to be interesting, walkable, vibrant, safe, etc. And I'm going to go quickly through the next 3 because we've actually added them this week while listening to folks like you. People have said, what about this one? Someone asked, what about the cap? Well, they didn't use that term, but what about the top of the building? Because we don't like the mechanical equipment that's up there, or even the cell towers, and what about how that's screened and such, which is an excellent point, and I should have thought of that. So how the building actually touches the sky is not as important probably, but also important relative to how it touches the ground. And it certainly affects how the building is appreciated from across the water, if it's in a context where you're going to see it from other parts of the city. So we're going to address that. This is a bit of a catch-all to relate to, even once you have the massing right, what are all the other architectural choices that you're going to make? The materials, the color, the rhythm of the facade, and different ways that you can make a building feel more contextual to a heritage context, for example, through materials, or diminish the massing, the feel of the heaviness of a building through material or color or what have you. The message I gave you last year was a good tailor can help me hide this. A good architect can diminish the impact of a massing and make a building seem less tall, less wide. Now, it's not a magic trick because there's only so much good architecture can do, and it can't make a building that's too tall and too wide okay, but it can mitigate and it can improve. So we want to think about too. People like to talk about materials, we've realized, in this week of conversation. And we will talk about that, but I want you to really appreciate all the other elements. And then how you integrate amenities, ground floor amenities, podium top amenities, rooftop amenities, internal amenities. On top of the kind of amenities that developments can contribute within the neighborhood, what do you expect or build to, within the buildings to make them more livable? So we can talk about that. Now, that's the tall buildings. I could probably go through as long a presentation on mid-rise, which is an equal part of this exercise, but I won't. I'll just say quickly that height is certainly a factor. People have asked how tall is a mid-rise compared to how tall is a high-rise. What we're generally saying at this point is mid-rise is is certainly 4 to 6 stories, and tall is probably 9 or 10 and above. But what we're discussing and what we welcome your comment on is for that 7 to 9 or 7 to 10 stories, do we count that as mid-rise? Do we count that as high-rise? Or one of the options we're thinking about is to keep it as a gray area and have the answer be contextual. In certain contexts, a 7-story may be a mid-rise. In others, it may be a high-rise. And we can keep the rules fluid based on context. But height is an issue with mid-rise. Step back similarly. Do you step back at the 5th and 6th floor, for example, of a 6-story building? We think about building length, which can have an effect, almost as much of an effect as building height. When you're thinking about the bigness of a building, a mid-rise may not be tall, but if it's the same thing for the entire long block, it can have, and it's monotonous, it can have a significant effect on your perception of how big that building is. And can you address that through architectural treatment and rhythm and breaking down of that facade expression to make it not seem so monotonous and long? And yes, obviously, of course, the ground floor. These are 3 examples of concrete buildings, and they're highly articulated. There's a lot of cuts to the box, if you will. But an interesting question we're asking is, what about wood frame? Because one of the challenges we know exist is, although you can do wood frame not in a boring box, you can articulate it, you don't have as much latitude as you do with concrete. Concrete you can shape and mold in a lot of different ways. Wood frame, you got to make sure it doesn't leak, and that really is a limitation. But wood frame has a lot of public benefits associated with it. It's a renewable resource, significantly less greenhouse gas emissions in the construction. It's less expensive, so the price point is more affordable, construction costs and leasing or owning costs. So there's a lot of public interest reasons to at least make sure we're not disincentivizing wood frame. Whether we incentivize it or not is a question, but you don't want to be accidentally, through your expectations for the shaping of the box, essentially pushing all the projects to concrete, because you can only do those shapings in concrete, you can't do them in wood frame, and we have the consequences of that particular, those policies. So we're thinking a lot about that, and this is about to get more interesting. I say interesting because we don't necessarily know the answers yet. Vancouver, for example, this is hot off the presses. Vancouver developer is proposing a 35 to 40 story wood frame tower. Doesn't exist in the world, isn't allowed anywhere. They're contemplating it as a special permission, as a test case. But already, British Columbia was the first province to bring in 6-story wood frame, and then the rest of the country relatively quickly followed suit. Last year, British Columbia brought in the code to allow 12-story. You're allowed to do 12-story wood frame in British Columbia. And they're saying the national code will probably change next year. So that means within a year or 2, you will be able to do 12-story wood frame construction here in Ontario. That could be a game changer, because there's a reason why you folks haven't seen 7, 8, 9-story buildings at all in much of Ontario, because the concrete costs of that relative to comparing it to a 6-story wood frame, it's not great numbers for a developer. But if you can do wood frame in those scales, you could get a lot more of that mid-rise with more market interest and maybe less taller towers. So that conversation even in the course of the year of our study, is going to keep advancing. So quickly, when we presented to council, we explained that we're going to take this work through a number of what we call project lenses to make sure, frankly, that we were being very careful not to create unforeseen consequences to our policy that we didn't want. One is making sure we understood the land economics. We want to make sure that what we're talking about works here as opposed to working in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver or New York City, and that we weren't hurting the city's interests in promoting affordability, because as we're doing this work, of course, you've got your affordability task force doing their work, and we want the efforts to be compatible. At the same time, with the wood frame versus concrete as an example, we want to make sure we're not having a negative impact in terms of climate change, because frankly, we want the opposite. This has to facilitate council's reaction to the climate emergency. We want to make sure we understand staff's skills and capabilities, so that the system we create, we can actually manage, and that it doesn't add more process and time well, maybe more time to the exercise, because we've been working on training and such in the keeping of this phrase, getting to a better yes faster. So we don't want more bureaucracy, we don't want more red tape, we want better outcomes, and we want them at least as fast or faster if possible. So no small task, we're putting a lot of pressure on ourselves to make sure we do it right, and that's why we're looking at the work through these various lenses. So I'll end with two slides, or a couple of slides. I said this to you a year ago. One of my heroes and my friend Jonathan Barnett, the great urbanist, likes to say, it's not how dense you make it, but how you make it dense. And I always slightly disagree with him, because I say it's both. It does matter how dense something is. And you can do things too tall and too dense. But it does matter at least as much how you make it dense. And I created this one for this exercise, which is parallel. It's not how high you make it, but how you make it high. And again, it's both. So our efforts in this exercise is to find multiple wins. Paige laid out at least 8 or 9 different goals and objectives, including important things like heritage, which become a great, significant part of every conversation about change in the city, sustainability, climate change, etc. I'm not a fan in contexts like this of the word balance. In other contexts, I don't mind that word, but balance sometimes can mean everyone is equally unhappy. The situation we actually are in is we have a lot of goals and we have to win in all of them. And that's where we are. So balance might not cut it. We need multiple wins, which is why we're looking at it through so many lenses, through so many goals and aspirations.
So as part of this project, we're doing a lot of research on what other areas are doing. We had some questions this morning. We're focusing a lot on Ontario because it's all within the same planning system, so we have the same tools, but we're also looking outside of Ontario as well. What I'm going to show you here is just a few kind of interesting highlights of what we've seen so far. So Kitchener has a really interesting approach to tall buildings in that it's much more mathematical than any of the other ones we've seen. They actually use a calculation to determine how big a tall building will be. Kitchener also gives a lot of direction on how to group buildings because the way that you orient buildings really matters. Tower separation, as Brent mentioned, also really matters. Burlington uses 25 meters between its buildings, and that's a pretty common requirement for how much space needs to be between towers. Toronto's approach, kind of among other things, shows how you can combine different scales of buildings, but also pay a lot of attention to amenities. So you can see here there's interior courtyard, rooftop terraces, that kind of thing. And the other interesting thing about this image is that there is a tall tower, a mid-rise building, and ground-oriented buildings all within one block. Now, Guelph pays a lot of attention in their mid-rise guidelines to streetscape details. And so that means, sort of your experience as you're walking down the street, things like street trees, setbacks from the lot line, step backs like Brent talked about, and also lots of openings onto the street. Toronto's approach to mid-rise buildings, a lot of the things that Brent talked about today is shown in this image. But I think that it also kind of shows how if you make your visuals overly complex, it can kind of complicate things. So when we're doing the visuals for our work, we want to make sure that they're very user-friendly and that the point of the image is really clear when you look at it. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to draw your attention to our Get Involved page. So this is a website. The address is at the top of the page. It's called Get Involved Kingston, and it's a platform for you to interact with this project. So you can ask questions through the platform, and then we post the question with our answer. So that's kind of neat because you can see what your neighbors are asking, and you can also kind of see what the conversation is like. So we really encourage you to go to this website. You need to make an account, and then you can sign in, and it will send you project updates as well. Now, on the kind of subject of project updates, you can also email me, Andrea Gummo, to ask to be put on the list. And the comment sheets that I sent out have my email address on there. So in terms of our public engagement plan, so right now we're in phase 1. We're basically, this is our last event for this week. Our next sort of phase of consultation will be in June to August when we have a draft issues and opinions paper for you. So this paper will go through what the various issues are and then what some options might be to address them. So we'll be bringing that to you and asking for your feedback on that document. And then we're aiming for fall of this year to actually take our draft policies and put them into the official plan. So it's a pretty quick timeline. And so that is part of the reason why I am asking that any comments on this stage of the consultation, please try to have them to me by May 15th. And that's also on the comment sheet.